Now for something a little different in the dog days of summer. Listeners of My Martin Amis may have heard of the book we're going to be discussing on this episode. Others may not have heard of it. But that book, Invasion of the Space Invaders, is a real anomaly in the bibliography of Martin Amis. Simon, I think it's probably best for me to allow you to say why it is that you got in contact to be on the podcast.
I suppose when I heard about Martin's death, I was on the tube. It's one of those deaths where he loomed so large in my life and meant so much, as he did to all of your guests and many other of the listeners, I'm sure, that, I remember exactly where I was when I heard a friend of mine, Keith Stewart, who is a journalist at The Guardian, texted me and said the news. And, I just felt this strange grief, as I'm sure many of us did. I didn't know Martin, didn't know his family. I hadn't had any interactions with him, but had read all of his books. He'd been a huge figure in my life as a freelance journalist throughout, my 20s and beyond. A sort of, lighter figure that was both aspirational, but also relatable in some ways. And, in the weeks and months after that, I just wanted to listen to him talking and people talking about him and his books. And so, you go on Spotify or, iTunes or Apple Podcasts or whatever and type in Martin Amis, and a bunch of live event recordings come up. And most of them I'd listened to before, but I listened to them all again and again in some cases, and found your podcast through that, and really enjoyed listening to some writers that I know, some writers that I don't know, talking about their favorite books. And Invasion of the Space Invaders, like you say, this anomaly of a book, came out in 1982, just before the release of Money, which I think was probably the book that changed his life. He'd written obviously a few novels before that and was a famous figure, I suppose, in literary London, but not at the scale that he would be after the release of Money. This was the last book that came out before that. And as someone who has written about video games throughout my career, that's how I started, as a freelance sort of writer for the specialist press, writing about games, but had always been aware of this book, had read it. Here was an example of a book where a serious literary figure had taken on the very unserious topic of video games, about which there has, always been a certain amount of scorn and snobbery. So, for a young writer wanting to take games seriously and write about them in a serious way, this book was really meaningful to me. And so I just thought, there's going to be loads of people wanting to talk to you about experience or, I don't know, the information, but probably fewer people wanting to talk about Invasion of the Space Invaders. So that's why I chanced my arm and wrote to you.
And we couldn't have asked for a better person to talk about this book. It's a delight to have you on, Simon. I wasn't sure when I met you whether or not you would start by saying I was a video game obsessive, a vid kid, a term that we'll probably come back to. And then I discovered who Martin Amis was. And then I discovered that he'd written this book about video games, or whether, as you've just revealed, Martin Amis was already an important figure to you, and that his writing about the arcade era of video games cemented how important he became to you as two obsessions collided. You mentioned that he was both aspirational and relatable. Could you say in what sense he was both to you?
I mean, aspirational in the sense that the prose is the best, right? And it's a cliche now for sort of male writers of a certain age to say that kind of thing, but I think it is undeniably sparkling and brilliant, and has a clarity of voice. There's no pretense in it, even though it can quite often be showy in some ways, or fireworky perhaps, but it feels authentic as well. And that's something that, yeah, as a writer in your young 20s, when you're trying to find your voice and figure out who you are and trying to get rid of, the things that sit in between your thoughts and what goes on the page, your own worries about how you're going to be perceived or wanting to be taken seriously, as you're trying to get rid of those so you get to who you actually are as a writer. Having an example like Amos, particularly his journalism, I think because he had such breadth in everything he did, different writers connect with him on different disciplines. But for me as a freelance writer, that was the stuff I loved, the collections of his journalism for the Observer, and that he was writing, all through his 30s. That's the stuff I connected with. And so, yes, having a great example of how you can go and do a interview with someone and write about it in a way that's both incisive and literary as well and exciting, that's the aspirational part. And relatable, particularly with this book, because it's kind of, we've got copies in front of us on the table here. It's got a terrible cover, I would say. It's such a weird book in that it is the first bit. I'm projecting. I don't know the story about how this book came about, but I can imagine you've got a 33-year-old writer who's got a bit of a reputation, who's having a successful career as a freelancer, turns up in New York, maybe someone from this imprint, Hutchinson, I think they're called, not a major imprint as far as I know, gets in contact and editor goes, we want to publish a book on video games, this new art form that's emerging. I've heard that you're interested in it. Would you do a book? And I can imagine Amos going, I've got, I'm in between novels. I've got a bit of time. Yeah, I'll take on this thing. And the first part of the book is sort of this anthropological survey of the arcade scene in New York at that time. And then there's this really weird bit where he's going through the different popular arcade games, almost explaining them. This is what Space Invaders is. This is what Donkey Kong is. And there's some light criticism in there as well. Then he's got a section where he's writing tips for video games as well, which is so strange. And there's even a quiz at the back, whereas you've got the pictures of the different sprites from arcade games. And just the idea of Martin Amis coming up with this sort of quiz, multiple choice quiz is just hilarious as well. But that I find that relatable, because maybe that's not the book he imagined was going to be created when he said yes to this project.
Let's just describe the book in front of us. It's got the format and dimensions of a collectible fanzine, right, doesn't it? And you've got this glossy cover and the image of what looks like a sort of space cowboy leaning nonchalantly against an arcade with an alien being creeping behind it. And in that sort of slanted Star Wars type, the words "Invasion of the Space Invaders." Now, Steven Spielberg writes the foreword.
Right.
That's an interesting place for it to start. This major director at that time in history able to put his name to this book.
It's a big flex. I don't want you to blurb my book. I want you to write the foreword, Steven Spielberg.
Which he does with enthusiasm. Turn to the first few pages and there is Steven Spielberg leaning against, a bit like the character on the front, an arcade game, Missile Command.
Mm-hmm.
And he has written, "The aliens have landed and the world can never be the same again. You've got to believe it. There's a war on. And the strange thing about this war is that if you should once make the mistake of volunteering, you'll find active service hopelessly habit-forming." How much of the arcade era did you have experience of before coming to this book?
It was definitely before my time, the games that they're writing about here and the experiences of I suppose, of these big amusement arcades in the middle of Manhattan or London is just a completely vanished world. It just doesn't exist and didn't really exist even when I was a kid, I don't think. There were some small arcades in London, but certainly not on the scale that it was here. Video games were invented sort of in the early 60s in MIT and Stanford. And then it took about 10 years for the first machines to start appearing in bars, things like Computer Space and Pong. And so, the time Amos is writing, 1981, 1982, you've had Space Invaders have been out for 3 years, I think. And so it's still very, very new. There's certainly no literary tradition around people writing about games, although there had been obviously pieces. There's a piece from the early 70s in Rolling Stone in which The writer, Stephen Brand, I think it is, who was a contemporary of Lester Bangs and all those, goes along to Stanford to watch a space war tournament. And the photos are done by Annie Leibovitz, who's undoubtedly the most famous profile photographer of the 20th century. So there was some writing about games, but yeah, this example of Amos is really one of the first serious pieces of a serious writer tackling this subject. And so for me, not having experienced these spaces as a kid, it offers a real window into it. I mean, I've played all of the games subsequently, through emulators or whatever, and so I'm very familiar with some of these games and what's going on behind them. You mentioned Missile Command there that Spielberg is leaning against, which is a really interesting game. It's all about you're intercepting ICBMs that are streaking over from presumably the Soviet Union onto the Californian coast, and you have to try and explode them before they detonate. And the designer of that game had nightmares because he was making this game in the context of the Cold War. So yeah, there's interesting stuff going on in these very rudimentary games, I think, the contextual stuff that Amos starts to draw out really for the first time. I think that a writer's doing that.
Having played some of these games yourself through emulators, how much do you agree with his reviews?
Well, I mean, I think his appraisals of the games are a little flippant. So I think he calls Frogger a dogger, and he's got all these sort of like slightly acerbic, funny ways of referring to the games that feel quite flippant and not particularly in depth. He talks about Space Invaders and refers to it sort of as the old granddad of the sort of emerging medium, and you've got to respect it, but it's a bit boring now, and all of this kind of thing.
Yeah, there's a whole glossary, isn't there?
Yes.
Dog meaning bad machine, also poodle meaning bad machine. I wonder whether these are terms that VidKids would have used back then, VidKid being another one of those terms meaning young video addict, or whether these were terms that Martin Amis invented. I don't know.
Yeah, good question. The more incisive stuff he does is where he's talking about, or where he's writing about what the appeal is. He's examining and interrogating what is it about these machines that is drawing me in. There's a great bit that I've quoted a few times in pieces I've written where he likens he detects in video games something of the allure of the novel, and he quotes Ian Forster who says of the novel, the thing that compels you is wanting to know what happens next. And says it's exactly the same thing in Space Invaders and everything else. You want to sort of follow the story to the conclusion. And the fact that he is sort of situating video games, which of course are their own thing, and they're not novels and they're not films, but there's some sort of coherent compulsion in all of these things that appeals to us as human beings. That's the stuff that feels, even now, fresh, like a fresh insight, and something which feels true as well. So yeah, for me, that's the real value of his insights here, as well as, anyone who has written book reviews of fiction and non-fiction knows that the sort of the most boring part of that is having to say what the story is, the premise. And it's also true of writing about video games. There's nothing more dull than having to explain the rules of a board game. That's why, or a video game. That's why when you sit down, you just want to get past the instructions as quickly as possible and start playing. And I think Amos instinctively knows this, so he doesn't spend a long time explaining how you play Centipede or whatever. He is much more interested in sort of giving this anthropological survey of what it's like to be in New York in 1981 when there's an arcade craze happening. Who are the kind of people that are walking into the arcades? He describes them, in the same, using all the same powers that he uses in his fiction and in his novels and in his narrative non-fiction journalism as well. And that's just the real treasure, I think, in this piece of work.
Give us an example.
All right, this is a section under the heading Bug-Eyed Monsters. Who are these that haunt the electronic grottos where the machines sing and the earthlings play? Who are these proletarian triffids, these darkness worshippers, hooked on the radar, rumble and wow of friendly robots who play with you if you pay them to? You think those ogres and hellhounds up on the screens look pretty bad, but take a look around here at the human aliens and what do you see? The strolling bouncers and extras in their damson DJs, the sleepy-looking outlaw behind the glass screen with his money bags and coin chutes, zonked glueies swearing skinheads with childish faces full of ageless evil, Mohican punks sporting scalp locks in violet verticals and a nappy pin through the nose, 7-foot black kids on roller skates, coolly monitored by their more mystical and whacked-out older brothers, all gone on ganja, dreadlocks and petty crime, 10-year-old trogs, knowing little vandals, foul-mouthed and furious, and very easily frustrated, queasy spivs living out a teen dream movie with faggot overtones, bemused, doddering hippies, attracted by the lights, blazered schoolboys, fascinated, terrified, calling everyone sir, classic, textbook child molesters, and in New York, hip Madison Avenue ad-execs and MIT whiz kids enjoying their coked-up coffee break. These are the displaced mineshaft spirits of the present age. Their grandparents must have worked underground. What are they all doing? How can they all afford it? I can't. The arcades are addictive, says New York psychologist Mitchell Robin. The lights, the sounds, that all makes it womb-like. You wonder, what kind of womb did this guy grow up in? I mean, problematic bits in there. But also you can see... It feels like an opening salvo for money, right?
It really does. It really does. I mean, anyone who hasn't read this book, but who has, and I'm sure probably most listeners of this podcast have read Money, will already hear John Self walking around the temples of temptation.
Right. I mean, this really feels like his notebook for Money in some ways. It's him walking around with a notepad and pen, jotting down what he says. He's playing with descriptive language here as well to give not just to describe what we're seeing in our mind's eye, but also to give a sort of aroma and feeling of the place as well.
Of the video games he writes about in this book, which criticism did you find yourself disagreeing with most vehemently?
I think he's quite rude about Donkey Kong. Let me
I read that one too. It's not the Donkey Kong as most people know it today, though, is it? It's a very rudimentary prototype for Donkey Kong. This was
Super Mario's debut, so it was designed by Shigeru Miyamoto, who is probably the most famous game designer in the world. He wasn't at the time that Amos is writing, but he goes on to be. And even Mario appears in Donkey Kong. And actually we can see in the screenshot, he's there, sort of a little tubby plumber who's bald. He's not wearing his hat there. But in this game, he's just called Jumpman. He's not even been christened Mario yet, I don't think, at this point. But, Donkey Kong holds up, I think, it's certainly of its time, but you can play it now, and there's certainly a lot of healthy competition around Donkey Kong, and people are still going for high scores. There's a brilliant documentary called King of Kong, which documents, the sort of very best players in the world competing for the top scores. So I don't completely agree with Amos here.
He says here, I have a vision in which this machine is perched on top of the Empire State Building and inexorably strafed into destruction. Donkey, your days are numbered. The knacker's yard awaits you.
Very fun, but also very wrong, because, of course, Donkey Kong goes on to become Super Mario Brothers and then becomes one of the most successful video game series ever. And, of course, last year was the highest grossing film as well. Beat out every other film in Hollywood, the Mario film. So, not... I think he's a bit off on that, but like I say, I mean the middle section where he's writing about specific games, I think is the least interesting part of what he's doing. It seems like this is where he feels out of his depth, writing about the mechanics of games and what's good about them, what's not. The bit where he's much more in his comfort zone is in this observation of what it's like to be in an arcade. And also, he writes really well about his own descent into obsession with video games as well. It might be worth reading the section where he goes into when he first became obsessed with games.
Absolutely,
should we do that?
Absolutely. Before we do that, though, I want to ask you, Simon, how seriously do you think Amos's criticisms, Amos's reviews of these games were taken by the people making them at the time? Do you think that he would have been known to them whatsoever? Do you think that they would have paid the slightest bit of attention?
With video games, much more than with novels or perhaps more similar to films on the box office. But with a video game, you shove it in a bar, and at the end of the night, you see how good the game is by how many quarters are in the machine, right? So it's a very quick feedback loop of how well your game is performing. And I think as well that, as I was saying earlier, there just wasn't a tradition of video game criticism at this point. It doesn't really start to emerge properly until the early 90s, I'd say, where you get writers who are much more seriously picking apart games and what they think they do well and what they do poorly, and making comparisons and the sort of work that you would see in other fields of criticism. So yes, I think this book arrived and passed without being, the people at Atari or Nintendo in Tokyo taking too much notice.
Sure, that by the 90s you had video game critics who actually knew how they worked on the inside and could critique them from a more technical standpoint that might get under the skin of those who made them,
right,
as opposed to Amos.
Yeah, and by that point as well, there's a canon starting to emerge. All the stuff that just happens in every artistic entertainment medium, that you need a bit of time for games to come out, for people to understand, for genres to start to accumulate, and for people to understand what the high points are, and why certain things work well and why certain things fail. And just there is none of that at this point. He's coming in sort of to a completely empty space and trying to figure out how to write about this stuff.
So let's hear the confessional from Martin Amis, the video games addict.
I mean, once again, there might be some points here where I feel quite awkward reading this. That's it. That's right. It's called Suddenly One Summer. It happened in 1979. I was in the south of France that summer when the invasion began. I was sitting in a bar near the railway station in Toulon. I was drinking coffee and writing letters and generally minding my own business. The bar had a pinball machine, a creaking old hulk with a card game motif. There were only a few locals in there at the time. Suddenly there was commotion, and the fat, aproned maitre began to supervise a delivery at the door. Grunting heavies were wrestling with what looked like a sheeted refrigerator. They installed it in the corner, plugged it in, and drew back the veil. The invasion of the Space Invaders had begun. Now I had played quite a few bar machines in my time. I had driven toy cars, toy aeroplanes, toy submarines. I had shot toy cowboys, toy tanks, toy sharks. But I knew instantly that this was something different, something special. Cinematic melodrama blazing on the screen, infinite firing capacity, the beautiful responsiveness of the defending turret, the sting and pow of the missiles, the background pulse of the quickening heartbeat, the inexorable descent of the bomb-dumping monsters, my awesome task to save Earth from destruction. The bar closed at 11 o'clock that night. I was the last to leave, tired but content. The owner's wife smiled at me understandingly as I stumbled out. At first I thought it was just a holiday romance. But deep down I knew all along this was the real thing. I had been ravished, transfigured, swept away. I had been invaded. Now, after nearly 3 years, the passion has not cooled. I don't see much of Space Invaders anymore. It's true, though we're still good friends. These days I fool around with a whole harem of newer, brasher machines. When I get bored with one of them, a younger replacement is always available. I still spend the odd night with Space Invaders, my first love, just for old time's sake. The only trouble is, they take up all my time and all my money, and I can't seem to find any girlfriends.
Importantly, I think what Martin Amis is channeling there is the fact that for so many young men, game consoles are becoming like friends or girlfriends. As he describes there, he talks about it as this summer dalliance that leaves him forever changed.
Yeah, it's very linked to his sexual appetite, all of this, isn't it? I mean, it's very sexy, everything he's writing here. It's sort of like, constant one-night stands with different, essentially women. And then he's got the kicker joke that, although it's preventing me from getting any girls.
Did you feel that this was painfully prescient to the way in which video games would become an outlet for horny, lonely young men? I mean, I hate to stereotype video game fans. As I say, I have been one of them myself. Mm. But do you think he is unfairly or accurately framing the way in which these games can become a great source of emotional catharsis for suppressed longing?
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it, that it's right there at the start of this medium. We've all, as people who like books, as everyone listening to this is, we've all had that experience of reading a book and you can't put it down. You have to keep reading it. You read it till 3 a.m. because you want to finish it, because you've got 25% of it left or whatever. And we don't associate that with masturbation in the way that we do with a video game that you can't put down. Similarly, we've all been sat in front of Netflix and you just go, one more episode, and you end up, the whole night's gone. What is it about video games, the fact that they are compelling and they're difficult to break away from if you allow them in, and they get their hooks into the human mind, that makes us associate them with, solitary pursuits, which Amos does elsewhere in the book? It's not only, he's likening these machines to girlfriends, but he also sort of talks about onanism and that kind of thing as well with respect to video games. So I'm not quite sure. Maybe it's the fact that they predominantly appealed, or the cliche at least, is they predominantly appealed to young men. And certainly by the late 80s, there's the association of young men playing them in their bedrooms with the curtains drawn and the lights down. But, Amos is writing here before all of that, and he's talking about being in a public space, being in a, next to that passage I just read, there's an illustration of supposedly sort of a slightly crude drawing of the Café do Brasil, where you can see Amos through the glass playing the Space Invaders cabinet, and so he's just there, I suppose, like on a date or something is the implication with what he's writing there as well. It's curious, I think. One thing I'd like to mention here is just on a prose level, the title of the book is just interesting, isn't it? Because it's got that repetition of invasion in invaders, which is, he's breaking a rule. You're supposed to use elegant variation, right? If you were writing a piece for the New York Times and you tried to put that headline on it, the editor would say you need to find another word because it's a repetition. And elsewhere in his books, Amos he makes the case against elegant variation, which I guess he's sort of doing here. But I can't quite figure out why he's chosen to break that rule at this particular time with this thing. It's just, it feels strange and not especially clever in the way that you think it would be if he's going to go to the trouble of doing something like this. Do you know what I mean?
Absolutely. I've thought this many times reading it and saying the title out loud. I absolutely agree. That repetition is irksome.
Going back to talking about what's relatable about this book, the fact that it does feel that he was perhaps not completely in control of the final product. The illustrations are kind of all over the place. It's a mixture of very elegant photography inside arcades with quite crude drawings and illustrations. And there's one illustration that goes alongside. Amos recounts a story of being in an arcade in London at 1 a.m. and then these 4 police officers bursting in behind him to arrest someone. And then next to that picture, it's got an illustration of that scene that could have come out of Viz or something. And then, the fact that towards the end of the book, you've got this quiz. There's also a section where they just present some computer code for a reader to type into their own machine, which will then produce a game for them to play, which was a big thing that would happen in computer game magazines in the 80s. I don't think he would have imagined all of that stuff in this book. So I kind of like that, he's 33 years old. When this comes out, he's, entering that second phase of your career, I'd say, where you've sort of established yourself a bit, but you're not fully in control. He's not the powerful, maybe he didn't even run this book through his agent. I don't know. He just thought, I'll just do it on the side for a bit of freelance income. These are the things that you actually do when you're a freelance writer. And that's why I love it. I just love that the book is like this, that someone as esteemed as him has sort of been buffeted by these commercial forces. Even the great Amos, I find that reassuring in some way.
I believe it was said at his memorial, if I remember rightly, that he never did anything that he didn't want to do.
Sure.
I mean, you could say that this was one of those bridging pieces of work between novels, but the prose oozes enthusiasm.
Right.
He does write here about something called bleeping sickness.
Right.
This is another one of those terms. It's in the glossary. But here it says, in the summer of 1980, the town elders of Snellville, Georgia, evicted all the video games from Gwinnett Chopette. Kids don't know when to stop, said Councilman S.W. Odom. Nor did the kids learn. They simply started cycling into the next county in search of the Wizard of War. That's W-O-R. A year later, the Philippines slapped a ban on the space games, claiming that the machines were playing havoc with the morals of their youngsters. No doubt the kids were now snorkeling to Borneo to try their luck. In Japan, soon after video fever broke, a 12-year-old boy held up a bank with a shotgun. He didn't want notes, just coins. Under interrogation, the kid cracked. It was Space Invaders that had put the squeeze on him. In Italy, where ordinary fruit machines are banned, there have been many confirmed cases of Invaders-related child prostitution. England, 13th of November 1981, it was reported in the press that a schoolboy, 14 years old, had sold sex in a car park for £2, or, as he explained, for 10 games of Space Invaders. Now that brings the theme of all of this into a much darker place.
Right.
And also underscores the fact that much as he might have revelled in a lot of these phenomena, he was also troubled by them, and in some cases disgusted by them.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I mean, I'm not sure if Amos quite pulls it off. It's a little scattershot, isn't it? You know, going from, if we think of that description of all the people coming in and playing video games, this sort of anthropological eye on it, and then it's a big tonal shift to then come to these several pages where he's talking, it's essentially reporting on crimes that have happened from young people and exploitation and abuses of power where young people have been wanting to fund their habits. I'm not quite sure he sort of pulls that together in a unifying way, and that's also, you know, true of this whole book, which is a bit of a tonal melange, really, and, you know, going from game tips about Donkey Kong to exploitation is a lot, but, you know, that's not alien to Amos's other work, right? He is interested in all these different facets of the things that he writes about. And like you say, he had this period, hadn't he, that he writes about in Experience and Inside Story when he was a teenager, where he's hanging around betting shops. He understands that the things that we can become obsessed with can have, you know, great negative effects on our lives if they're not held in balance with more positive things, or just you know, a range of different activities and people, and in a sense of community, that if it becomes your one sole obsession, that it can lead to darker places. And I think he wants to put that in the book, but it's you know, perhaps doesn't do the work of you know, pulling apart where the responsibility of the designers of these games lies, and where the responsibility of the people playing them lies, and all of that kind of thing. You know, it doesn't really get into that. It's just more a bit scattershot, I'd say.
We haven't actually talked about Space Invaders enough. That is the game that really sits at the center of all of this. Do you want to read from the passage of the chapter on Space Invaders and give us a bit of a flavor of what this game is about and why it's so important?
Yeah. Space Invaders is owed the respect paid to the senior member of any family, even though we all admit that the old boy has become a bit of a bore in his declining years. Now, don't get me wrong, if it hadn't been for Space Invaders, none of us would be where we are today. The main innovation of Space Invaders was as follows. It gave you real drama on the screen. Who cares whether you can eliminate dots with an electric tennis ball? So what if you can knock down 10 plastic cowboys on a shooting range? Who gives a toss when a toy car skids on a patch of toy oil? After Space Invaders, we were defending Earth against monsters in sublunar skies. Here they come again. The Tyro player, the kid to whom the experience of being invaded is relatively novel, puts in his coin, slides his turreted tank into centre stage and blasts happily away at the massed, bomb-dumping aliens. For 30 seconds or so, he'll be pleased with his progress and confident about his chances. 30 seconds later, all three of his tanks, or lives, will have been blown away. Why? The phalanx of enemy invaders moves laterally across a grid not much wider than itself. When it reaches the edge of the grid, the whole army lowers a notch. Rule 1, narrow that phalanx.
Narrow that phalanx.
Yeah, so a good friend of mine, Christian Donlan, who actually introduced me to Amos when I was much younger, he had this book before I did. He had got it out of the library, and so we would say that line to each other lots of times. It's just a sort of very succinct, enviably succinct way of sort of giving a video game tip. But yeah, so Space Invaders comes out in the late 70s in Japan. It's designed, it's published by Taito, which is sort of one of the long-running arcade manufacturers in Japan. And I think the story goes that it became so popular in Tokyo that they had a shortage of 50 yen coins or 100 yen coins, their national shortage, because so many people were playing the game. The reason I think it becomes so iconic is because of the design of the aliens. It became, they're these sort of little pixelated alien designs, and it's very recognizable, and it became a kind of shorthand for video games for a long time. In fact, the cliche for a video game book now is to have a Space Invader on the front of it, even now, sort of 40, 50 years later.
Yeah, that's now the skeuomorph, isn't it? In your phone, if you type in the word video game, you'll get a few things, a joystick, but you'll also get a little Space Invader.
A little Space Invader. Yeah, exactly. So, I think even by 1982, it's sort of lodged itself in the cultural consciousness as just a visual shorthand for what video games are. And that's probably why either Amos or his publisher said, that needs to be in the title.
Again, just looking at some of the terms that he creates, he says here, the casualty wards of metropolitan hospitals are fighting an epidemic of colourful new maladies. Asteroid elbow, Pac-Man finger, Galaxian spine, centipede disc. This is very, very Amos.
Yes.
Did you find yourself thinking when you first read this, God, this is how video games ought to be written about? Does Martin Amos write about video games well by any critic standards, do you think?
Yes, I think, in that passage you picked out there, what I love is he's yoking these very sort of big intergalactic words with parts of the body, right? And ailments, asteroid elbow, Pac-Man finger. And I love his consideration, his understanding that playing video games is a physical activity. We do it with our hands, with our bodies, and it can have effects on us. That's something that I try. Certainly after reading this, I sort of introduced into my own writing about games, and I've seen other novelists who have written about games do the same thing, writing about what are the things you're doing with your hands, the sort of this intimate physicality of playing video games. And that's certainly not something that you would have seen with sort of specialist press critics writing in the 90s. They were not interested in any of that kind of stuff. But I love that, Amos is constantly situating the act of playing a video game in physical spaces, in physical bodies, in communities. And these are things that absolutely have influenced me and the kinds of things that I want to do when I write about games, because it's grounding, right? It takes you away from this idea of just writing about abstract aliens. It's that thing of, good writing, and Spielberg does this in his films as well when he's writing about extraterrestrial themes. It's about how do you root it in the human, in the familiar, in the domestic. That's when you start to get to the good stuff, when you take the big angle stuff and root it with, what's happening with your fingers.
I remember as a kid growing up with the Nintendo 64, people were starting to talk on forums about a sort of strange grey gunk that could start to form on your hands from playing with the console controller for too long. I just wondered, I suppose, whether or not this book was the equivalent of the war against cliche to video game critics at this point, a great source of correctional rule of thumb when you want to freshen things up.
I think that might be an overreach, but in the sense that, I would still read the war on cliche to sort of get that revitalizing shot of, this is how you can write about a text, whether it's a film, whether it's a book. Obviously there are differences in how you approach these works and how you would approach, writing some criticism about a video game. But, I would probably find that book more useful. What I love about this particular book is more his reportage, the way that he can conjure a scene. And also this window into this vanished world, which, is regretful, I think. It's sad that there aren't video game arcades, because it's fun to stand behind someone who's very accomplished at a game and watch them play. It's like watching someone play a piano at Victoria Station. You can go, there's someone who's accomplished. That's enjoyable. I get that same feeling if in those, few times when you do get to stand behind someone who's playing a game, playing Dance Dance Revolution or something. It's enjoyable to watch someone who's doing something like that. So I'm sad that world has vanished to a certain degree, and that there aren't these public spaces where people can play. It's all gone into our phones. It's gone into our houses. And so I just love this book as a sort of window into that world, and I mourn its disappearance.
But there are video game emporiums still around, aren't there? I mean, increasingly there are bars that install old school games. Are there places that you go to when you need a dose of that?
Yeah, I mean, the London Trocadero, which was probably the best known in London arcade, closed down maybe a decade ago, slightly more than that. And someone bought all of the machines and set up a sort of new arcade. I think it's in Croydon now, where you can go and play some of those rescued machines. But yeah, as you say, there was this, 5-6 years ago, there was definitely a craze for hipster types setting up, barcades, as they were called. And there were a couple of very good ones in New York, one in Manhattan, one in Brooklyn. And, those are filled with the actual machines that Amos is writing about here. And I played Asteroids in Barcade in New York, 30 years after Amos is writing about it here. And there is something lovely about that. How sustainable those are as the machines age and as their components break, and no one makes the kinds of screens that went into these machines anymore, so I don't know how long they'll be around for. But yeah, you're right, there are sort of little pockets where you can go and experience something of what Amos is writing about here.
Simon, I can't tell you how grateful I am that you came to me. As I say, I don't know who else would have come to me with Invasion of the Space Invaders. So thanks so much again. I wonder, would you do the honor of completing the introduction that I started with at the beginning from Steven Spielberg?
Look at Martin Amis, the author of this book. Once a fine, upstanding young man leading a blameless life, he was transformed within a few short games into a terminal case of video addiction, his brain seething with little green monsters, lemons, smart bombs, boulders, and fat boys, the tireless assailants of the video game screen. Urgent treatment was called for, and now, after thousands upon thousands of games, to say nothing of the chastening experience of writing this book, the patient seems to be on the road to recovery. But don't fall into the same trap. Read this book and learn from young Martin's horrific odyssey round the world's arcades before you too become a video junkie. Don't assume that because of your innate strength of character you can avoid this fate. It has happened to the best of us, and I speak as one who knows. I've actually exceeded 500,000 at Missile Command, but have not broken beyond 75,000 at the super updated machines. I love he's boasting about his high scores. The warnings are clear. Part 1 explains how the invaders took over, virtually without anyone realizing what was happening, and infiltrated themselves into every corner of the known world, claiming victims of every race, color, and creed. Then in Part 2, you have your own consumer guide to the arcade machines with advice on battle tactics from a seasoned campaigner. Part 3 reveals how the invaders, far from confining their activities to public spaces and consenting adults, have established themselves in our homes in various shapes and forms to the extent that there's really nowhere left to go to avoid them. Well, that's if you really want to. I don't want to be accused of collaboration, but some of them are really quite friendly when you get to know them.
Thank you, Simon, for joining me on My Martin Amis.
Thanks for having me.